Everybody, this is the second video on Howard Zinn's article. We're going to talk about Chauncey Depew, the Iraq War, and McKinley. Okay, I talked about Chauncey Depew as a bagman, and I guess one of the ways to think about it is, for those of you who are sports fans, if you watch sports and you see commentators, typically the commentators have favorite teams, but their analysis isn't usually skewed by that perspective, right? You can watch SportsCenter or watch any of the other million shows, and the people who are commenting aren't hacks, right? In that sense, they aren't in the bag for somebody. But when it comes to politics and when it comes to history, things get a lot murkier. And so you get bagman who basically Depew exemplifies, and to some extent, Zinn argues that Samuel Eliot Morison also does the same, because Morison ignores the Journal of Columbus, which should have been the first thing he looked at. You go to any decent library, in fact, you can read the Journal of Columbus. So this shouldn't be something that he ignored. So if a professional historian is ignoring important, indeed fundamental evidence in favor of something else, they're in the bag. If you're Chauncey Depew and you're talking about Columbus and you're saying, oh, this is from this perspective, or you're basically kind of linking it to patriotism as opposed to the kind of actual history, you may be a bagman. And so the world of history, and certainly when you watch commentators on politics, they're more often bagmen than they're not. Okay, now the Iraq War, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the McKinley War. Actually, I may switch that up. So the McKinley, the war in the Philippines is much easier. In 1898, the U.S. went to war ostensibly over the explosion of the USS Maine in the Havana Harbor. And so the U.S. went to war to liberate Cuba, as well as the Philippines, from the Spanish, and to avenge the Maine, which, as later historians found out, the Spanish had nothing to do with. It's just their boiler blew up. But when the war was over, the question was, well, what does the U.S. do with these territories? And the territories, and McKinley has this thing where he says, we could have let them be self-governing, but that would have been wrong. And I prayed to God, and God told me, no, you should take them on. The United States should take them on. Now, this, and he mocks McKinley pretty hard. And if you had seen this in a talk, you would probably have laughed, even if you didn't know much about it. But McKinley is basically saying the reason why we didn't give the Filipinos and the Cubans full independence, even though they've been fighting a war for it, was because God told us to. That's a kind of, in retrospect, that's a fairly ludicrous idea. You would probably say, maybe not serious. McKinley's treating us like, we kind of wink, wink, nod, nod, know that these people are brown-skinned and we're not going to take them seriously. So of course they can't be self-governing. They're not white. Well, certainly this is, and that certainly applies to the third territory, which we acquired in that war, which is Puerto Rico, which remains as a territory and ruled by Congress rather than part of the United States, but not part of the United States. They are, so the Supreme Court ruled, they are foreign in a domestic sense. The Iraq War was a short, sharp military victory over Saddam Hussein's forces that had invaded Kuwait and were holding it as a territory of Iraq. The battles were so lopsided that the U.S. basically, at one point in the war, was using bulldozers to bury Iraqi soldiers alive. And that's mainly because the Iraqi military had two kinds of armies. They had the real one, which is the Republican Guard, and then they had everybody else who were cannon fodder. They wouldn't even give those guys munitions in some cases, or wouldn't let them practice with munitions because they weren't sure how they would respond. So all of that kind of stuff was happening kind of in real time, and you could see it. I remember the story about burying the soldiers alive because I heard it on the radio, and it was on the air at 8 o'clock, and then it was gone by 9 o'clock. They didn't want to talk about it because if you have that conversation, the Iraqis seem less like invaders and more like just victims who were kind of bullying. Not that what the Iraqis did was right, and I don't think Zinn would have said that, but just refusing to kind of accept that there's a human dimension and just focusing on the laser guided missiles that are hitting a building, or just focusing on how bad Saddam is, and then Saddam stands in for everybody in Iraq, is part of what he's talking about with dehumanization. So that's it. Thanks.